My mother stood in our living room holding a glass of champagne, toasting to the fact that she was officially kicking me out. I didn't cry. I took action. 14 days later, her world collapsed and she never saw it coming. If you grew up in a functional, healthy environment, the idea of a mother throwing a literal party to celebrate evicting her own daughter probably sounds like a dark comedy sketch. You might think there must have been some massive blowout, some unforgivable crime I committed to warrant that level of public humiliation. But if you grew up in my family, you know the truth. It was just a Tuesday. Her name was Helen. I do not call her mom anymore. The word implies a level of warmth, safety, and maternal instinct that she was entirely incapable of providing. Helen was a woman who viewed her children not as human beings, but as assets and liabilities on a balance sheet. And in her meticulously crafted ledger of life, I was the ultimate liability, while my older brother, Chase, was her blue-chip investment. Chase was the golden child. That is not an exaggeration born of sibling rivalry. It was a verifiable fact, documented through 30 years of exhausting double standards. While I was expected to buy my own clothes from thrift stores starting at age 14, because building character was essential for me, Chase was handed the keys to a brand new S.Ed for managing a C- average in high school. While my accomplishments, a full academic scholarship, a master's degree, a successful career in corporate forensic accounting were met with dismissive waves and the muttered "that's nice," Chase's mere existence was treated like the second coming of greatness. Chase was always finding himself. Chase was a visionary. In reality, Chase was a 32-year-old man who had never held a steady job for more than 6 months. He spent his days in the master suite of our rented house, playing video games, ordering expensive food delivery, and aggressively brainstorming his next failed app idea. The housing situation we shared was the absolute core of Helen's control over me. 3 years ago, Helen went through a financially devastating divorce with my stepdad. She was terrified of losing the upper-middle-class lifestyle she felt the universe owed her. She found a beautiful, spacious 4-bedroom house in a prime, tree-lined neighborhood, but she couldn't even come close to affording the rent on her own. So she came to me. She wept. She played the victim flawlessly. She told me we needed to stick together, that family was all we had when the chips were down. I had a highly lucrative job and was living quite comfortably in a minimalist downtown apartment. But the gaslighting was so intense, so historically ingrained in my psyche, that I folded. I broke my lease, packed up my quiet, peaceful life, and moved in with her. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary. I would take the smallest, darkest bedroom in the basement, paying exactly 75% of the total rent, while she and Chase took the sprawling main floors. She told me it was just until Chase gets his startup funded, and just until I get back on my feet. But weeks turned into months, and months turned into 3 long, suffocating years. Every month, on the first of the month, I would transfer my massive portion of the rent into Helen's bank account. She insisted on being the one to write the single check to the property management company, claiming it looked better for her credit score to be the primary payer. I didn't care. I was working 60-hour weeks, exhausted, just wanting a quiet place to sleep. But quiet was a luxury I was absolutely not allowed to have. Helen treated me not as a co-tenant, not even as a daughter, but as a deeply unwanted pest who was burdening her by existing in her space. If I left a clean coffee mug on the drying rack, I would receive a barrage of texts about how I was disrespecting her home. If I bought groceries and put them in the fridge, Chase would eat them within 24 hours. When I calmly brought it up, Helen would look at me with absolute disgust and tell me I was being horribly selfish. "He's your brother. He's under a lot of stress with his business. Why do you always have to make everything about you?" That was her favorite line. Everything was always my fault. Every tension in the house, every financial stressor she felt, was attributed to my negative energy. I was paying the lion's share of the bills, essentially funding Chase's extent. Dead adolescence and Helen's weekly expensive wine nights with her book club, yet I was treated like a parasite. I shrank myself down to almost nothing. I stopped cooking in the kitchen to avoid running into them. I stopped watching television in the living room. I practically lived in my small basement room, coming out only to work, pay the bills, and clean up their messes. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was being the bigger person. I thought that by absorbing the emotional hits, by never raising my voice, I was keeping the peace. But I want to pause here and say something very clearly to anyone listening who might be in this exact position. Keeping the peace is just slow self-destruction with a polite name. When you are dealing with a family system built on narcissism and a rigid golden child dynamic, your silence is not protecting you. It is weaponizing your own empathy against you. You see, in a toxic family structure, the peace you are keeping is not actual peace. It is simply the preservation of their comfort at the direct expense of your sanity. They rely on your guilt-conditioned, implanted belief that you are somehow responsible for their emotional regulation. They blur the lines between guilt and shame so perfectly that you stop realizing you haven't actually done anything wrong. They make you feel like you are the problem. I absorbed their financial burdens, I swallowed their daily humiliations, and I convinced myself it was out of family loyalty. But it wasn't loyalty. It was a trauma bond. It was a deeply ingrained habit of accepting absolute crumbs of basic tolerance and calling it a meal. I was acting as the voluntary shock absorber for a machine that was designed to run me over. I spent 3 years shrinking myself to fit into a life I was entirely paying for, trying to be invisible so they could be comfortable. I didn't know it then, but that Tuesday was the last day I would ever feel afraid of her. That was the setup. Now here's where I stopped being patient and started being precise. The breaking point did not happen in private. Narcissists rarely do their worst work behind closed doors. They need an audience to validate their cruelty. It was a Friday evening. I had just finished a grueling 70-hour week wrapping up a massive corporate audit. I pulled into the driveway to find it blocked by 5 unfamiliar cars. I walked through the front door, exhausted, carrying my briefcase and a takeout container. The living room was packed. Helen had invited her entire book club, a few neighbors, and several of Chase's unemployed gamer friends. There were balloons. There was an elaborate charcuterie board I had unknowingly paid for. And standing in the center of the room, holding a crystal flute of champagne, was my mother. She stopped talking when I walked in. The room went quiet. She smiled a wide, theatrical smile that simply did not reach her eyes. "Oh, perfect timing," she announced loudly, making sure every eye in the room was locked on me. "Everyone, let's raise a glass. I finally have some wonderful news to share." I stood frozen by the doorway. She walked over to the mantel, picked up a crisp white envelope, and strode toward me. "As you all know, I've been trying so hard to help my daughter get on her feet," Helen projected, her voice dripping with weaponized martyrdom. "But a mother's nest must eventually empty. It's time I reclaimed my space and my peace." She shoved the envelope into my chest. I opened it. It was a printed, 30-day eviction notice she had blatantly copied and pasted from some generic legal website. "Chase's app development is really taking off," she continued to the crowd as Chase nodded solemnly from the sofa, a beer in his hand. "He needs the basement for his new streaming studio. So, I'm officially kicking you out. Cheers to new beginnings." The room chuckled. A few people actually clapped. My own mother had thrown a party to celebrate rendering me homeless. My blood ran cold. Not from panic, but from absolute, crystalline clarity. For a fraction of a second, I felt the old, familiar urge to defend myself. I wanted to scream that I paid for the very champagne she was drinking. But then, the emotional temperature inside me dropped to absolute zero. I stopped feeling like a daughter. I started thinking like a forensic accountant. I looked at her. I kept my voice steady. 30 days, I said quietly. 30 days, she beamed proudly. And not a day longer. I didn't argue. I didn't cause a scene. I turned around, walked down to my basement room, and I packed my bags. I grabbed my laptop, my financial hard drives, and enough professional clothes for 2 weeks. I walked back up the stairs, straight past the bewildered party guests, out the front door, and checked myself into an extended stay hotel downtown. What I am about to tell you is the detail she overlooked, and the mistake that sealed her fate. 6 months prior to this party, the original owner of our rental house decided to liquidate his assets. He sent Helen a letter stating he was selling the property. Helen had panicked, terrified of losing her prestigious address. But a week later, the property management company sent a follow-up notice. The house had been purchased by a private investment firm, and the new owners would be honoring the car. And lease indefinitely. Helen was thrilled. She bragged to her friends about how lucky she was. What Helen didn't know was the name of that private investment firm. It was an anonymous LLC registered in Delaware. I was the one who set it up. I had used my corporate bonuses and stock options to buy the house quietly, entirely in cash. I did it because I knew her financial instability would eventually put my own living situation at risk. For 6 months, Helen thought she was renting from a faceless corporation. In reality, she was renting from me. She had just publicly evicted me from a house that I illegally owned. Sitting in my quiet hotel room, I opened my laptop and logged into the property management portal. I needed to see exactly how bold she had gotten. The hotel's Wi-Fi was abysmal, and the portal kept buffering. I sat there for 20 agonizing minutes, tethering my computer to my phone's cellular data just to get the PDF ledgers to download. When the files finally opened, I saw the truth. Let me be very clear about how this works. A document signed before a conflict is basic self-preservation. People who financially abuse you rely on chaos, guilt, and verbal agreements to keep you confused. But what a paper trail does is strip away their ability to manipulate the narrative. A paper trail is not just a collection of receipts. It is a legally binding shield. When you establish an LLC, when you refuse to mingle funds, and when you document every single transfer, you remove emotion from the equation. Financial abuse is still abuse, and it leaves evidence. You cannot gaslight a bank statement, and you cannot argue with a property deed. I pulled up the bank records. Every month, I had dutifully transferred my 75% of the rent to Helen's personal account, trusting her to forward the full amount to the property manager. But looking at my LLC's incoming payment ledger, the reality was stark. Helen hadn't paid the rent in 3 months. She had been quietly pocketing my massive monthly transfers to fund Chase's lifestyle, knowing the eviction process in our state was slow, and assuming the faceless corporation would take months to notice. She was deliberately letting the house go into default while bleeding me dry. That was the moment I decided a 30-day notice wasn't going to cut it. I picked up my phone and called the lead attorney at the property management firm. I gave him 2 very specific instructions. First, draft a formal, legally binding 3-day pay or quit notice for the 3 months of delinquent rent. Second, prepare to file a civil lawsuit for the misappropriated funds she had stolen from me personally. Are you sure you want to go nuclear? The attorney asked, fully aware the tenant was my mother. She threw a party. I replied flatly, let's give her some fireworks. For the next 13 days, I stayed in my hotel. I went to work. I ignored the passive-aggressive text messages Helen sent me about how I was overreacting by moving out early. I let her live in her delusion of victory. The trap was set, the documents were drafted, and I knew exactly when and where I was going to serve them. What I've told you so far is how they broke me down. What comes next is how I built back differently. It was day 14, a Sunday morning. Helen had decided to host a renovation kickoff brunch for Chase's new basement studio. I knew this because she had spent the last 2 weeks actively launching a vicious smear campaign on social media. She posted daily paragraphs complaining to her followers about how much trash her ungrateful, selfish daughter had left behind, and how financially exhausting it was to be a supportive mother to an adult child who abandons her family. She was curating the perfect victim narrative, gathering sympathy from relatives who had no idea I was the only reason she wasn't living in her car. I parked a block away from the house. I had arranged for a private process server to meet me there at exactly 11 o'clock. But reality is rarely cinematic, and perfect timing is an illusion. The server hit a massive multi-car accident on the interstate. I sat in my sweltering car for 40 agonizing minutes, staring at the steering wheel, my hands shaking slightly, terrified my nerve would break. I thought I was ready for that moment. I wasn't, not entirely. The sheer psychological weight of confronting the woman who had dictated my entire existence was suffocating. When the server finally pulled up in a faded gray sedan, looking completely bored and casually drinking a giant iced coffee, I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. We walked up the driveway together. I didn't knock. I still had my key. I pushed open the front door to the smell of expensive catering, the sound of clinking glasses, and the low hum of relaxed conversation. Helen was standing by the kitchen island, holding court with 3 of her closest friends and Chase. When she saw me, her smug smile returned instantly. She shifted her weight, preparing to perform for her audience. "Well, well. Look who decided to come crawling back," Helen projected loudly, her tone dripping with mock pity and supreme arrogance. "Did the real world get a little too expensive for you? I told you leaving so abruptly was a massive mistake. You can come back, but you are paying double rent for the inconvenience, and you're sleeping on the couch until Chase's studio is done." I let out a short, humorless laugh. The sheer audacity was almost a work of art. "I didn't come back to move in," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the ambient noise. "I came to collect." I nodded to the process server. He stepped forward, asked for Helen by her full legal name, and handed her a thick manila folder. He stated he was serving her, turned on his heel, and walked out the door. Inside that folder was the 3-day pay-or-quit notice for 3 months of delinquent rent. Beneath that was the civil lawsuit for the misappropriation of my personal funds. And on top of it all, highlighted in bright yellow, was the certified property deed listing my LLC as the sole owner of the house she was standing in. Helen smirked, rolling her eyes as if this were some pathetic, desperate prank I had pulled off the internet. She flipped open the folder. She didn't scream. She didn't rage or throw her glass. She just stood there, very still, reading the first page. Then she flipped to the deed. I watched in real time as her eyes darted across the legal jargon, finally landing on my name listed as the registered agent of the LLC. Her face drained of color. She looked like all the air had been violently sucked from her lungs. That was the last time she ever smiled in my presence. The room went dead silent. The kind of silence that rings in your ears. Nobody moved. Chase lowered his expensive mimosa, his jaw actually dropping as he realized his permanent free ride had just violently crashed into a brick wall. The friends who had just been laughing with her were now staring at the floor, deeply uncomfortable, realizing they had been enlisted as extras in a very ugly, very real financial fraud. Let me pause here, because this is where people usually get confused about what it means to be strong. People often confuse boundaries with cruelty. They think setting a hard limit, especially with family, is an act of aggression. But boundaries are simply a description of what you will and will not accept. Enforcing them is not a punishment, it is clarity. When you finally stop shielding a toxic person from the legal and financial consequences of their own actions, they will accuse you of destroying the family. They will scream that you were heartless and unforgiving. But you didn't break the family. You just stopped paying the premium to keep their illusion intact. You cannot reason with someone who benefits entirely from misunderstanding you. Standing there, watching her read those papers, I realized I wasn't being mean. I was just finally agreeing to the reality she had created. Leaving quietly, legally, permanently is the most powerful thing you can do. I kept my voice steady, staring directly into her terrified eyes. "You have 72 hours to vacate my property." I turned around and walked out the front door, leaving them suffocating in the wreckage of their own entitlement. It felt like the ultimate victory. I thought I had completely dismantled her power. But what I failed to understand was that stripping a narcissist of their control does not neutralize them, it radicalizes them. The real nightmare hadn't even begun. Walking out of that room felt like victory. But the next 72 hours taught me what victory actually costs. A cornered narcissist, stripped of their narrative control, is the most dangerous version of themselves. They didn't collapse quietly. They collapsed loudly, messily, and in a way that exposed exactly who they had always been. By the time I reached my car, my phone was already vibrating with a relentless barrage of text messages. The initial shock in that living room had quickly mutated into pure, unadulterated rage. Helen fired off dozens of texts, oscillating wildly between demanding I cancel the eviction, calling me a psychopath, and threatening to sue me for emotional damages. I didn't add them all. I simply archived the thread, quietly preserving the digital evidence. But I knew Helen wasn't going to just pack up and leave. She had lived her entire life believing consequences were things that happened to other people. I had anticipated retaliation, which is why, months earlier when I bought the house, I had legally installed discreet exterior security cameras overlooking the driveway, the backyard, RD, and the front porch. On Monday evening, just over 24 hours after the confrontation, the motion alerts on my phone started going off frantically. I opened the security app. The hotel's Wi-Fi was abysmal, and the connection kept buffering, freezing and dropping frames because the server was overloaded. I only caught fragments. I sat there in the dark, refreshing the screen repeatedly, my heart hammering against my ribs. When the feed finally stabilized, I saw exactly what she was doing. Helen and Chase were dragging heavy pieces of my furniture, which came with the house, out onto the front lawn. But they weren't moving it to take with them. They were leaving it out in the pouring rain. Worse, Chase was carrying a heavy iron crowbar, marching toward the custom wooden front door I had just paid to have restored. He was going to destroy the property. If he couldn't live in the Golden Child sanctuary anymore, he felt completely entitled to smash it. I didn't call them. I didn't scream through the camera's two-way audio feature. I picked up the phone and dialed the local police precinct. Because I was the legal property owner with a registered deed, I requested an immediate dispatch for active vandalism and trespassing. The police arrived within 12 minutes. Through the camera feed, I watched the flashing blue and red lights illuminate the drenched front lawn. I watched my mother, the woman who cared about neighborhood optics and social standing more than anything else in the world, stand barefoot in the rain, screaming at two officers why. Though they calmly inspected the digital deed I had emailed to their dispatcher. Chase, true to form, immediately dropped the crowbar and retreated inside, leaving his mother to face the authorities completely alone. The officers issued a stern warning. Any further damage to the property would result in felony destruction charges, and the 72-hour eviction notice was legally binding. They would be back on Wednesday morning to formally escort them off the premises. That night, the smear campaign reached its terrifying peak. Helen realized she couldn't physically destroy the house without going to jail, so she decided to burn my reputation to the ground instead. She called every extended family member, every mutual acquaintance, and even my stepdad. My phone began blowing up with voicemails from aunts and uncles I hadn't spoken to in years, calling me a monster, accusing me of throwing my own flesh and blood out onto the street. This is the part where most people break. When the flying monkeys descend, when the collective weight of family judgment crashes down on you, the instinct to surrender and apologize is almost overwhelming. You want to explain yourself. You want to show them the bank ledgers, the stolen rent money, the years of quiet, suffocating financial abuse. You desperately want them to see the truth. But here is a life lesson that you must internalize if you ever want to break free from a toxic family system. You cannot outlogic a smear campaign, and going no contact is not a dramatic punishment. No contact is a medical decision. It is the absolute, non-negotiable quarantine of a psychological virus that will otherwise consume your entire life. When you enforce no contact, you are not doing it to hurt them, you are doing it to stop the bleeding. The people who scream the loudest about loyalty, the aunts, the uncles, the enablers who demand you keep the peace, have almost always done the least to earn that loyalty. They want you back in the system, because your compliance is the only thing keeping the toxic machine running. If you step out of your assigned role as the scapegoat, the abuse has to go somewhere else, and they are terrified it will be directed at them. So you must understand, their anger is not about your supposed cruelty. Their anger is about losing their human shield. Do not defend yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Let them believe the villain narrative. Your peace is worth infinitely more than their validation. I didn't answer a single phone call. I blocked 23 numbers in the span of 2 hours. I sat in the silence of my hotel room, feeling the phantom guilt try to claw its way back into my brain, and I systematically shut it down. By Wednesday morning, the 72 hours were up. The deadline had arrived. I drove back to the neighborhood, parked 2 streets over, and waited for the sheriff's deputies to arrive for the civil standby. I watched as a cheap, rusted moving truck pulled into the driveway. Helen hadn't secured a new luxury apartment. What I found inside that folder on the kitchen counter changed everything I thought I knew about the past 7 years. I sat in my car, parked 2 streets over, watching through my phone's camera feed as the sheriff's deputies formally removed them from the property. Helen walked down the driveway, not with the grace of a wronged matriarch, but with the frantic, erratic energy of a scammer whose Ponzi scheme had finally collapsed. Chase followed, dragging 2 high-end monitors and a gaming chair, whining audibly to the deputies about his bad back. They piled into a cheap, rusted rental truck and drove away. When I finally used my key to open the front door, the house was eerily quiet. It smelled like stale champagne and desperation. In their chaotic, uncoordinated exit, they had left behind a mountain of trash. I had scheduled a commercial locksmith to arrive immediately and rekey all the exterior doors, but his previous appointment had run over, and he was delayed by nearly 40 minutes. I sat at the kitchen island, staring at the mess, waiting. That minor logistical delay, that imperfect, frustrating stretch of time, is the only reason I noticed the thick, unmarked manila folder shoved carelessly under a stack of junk mail. On the counter, I opened it. What I found inside changed everything I thought I knew about the past 7 years and entirely recontextualized my mother's financial ruin. Inside were heavily annotated bank statements, legal correspondences, and a finalized bankruptcy draft for Chase. But the most shocking document was a private trust ledger. During Helen's divorce from my stepdad, she hadn't been left destitute as she had tearfully claimed. She had received a massive, multi-six-figure settlement, but instead of securing her own future, she had quietly dumped every single penny of it into Chase's name to fund a series of catastrophic crypto investments and an LLC that was basically a legal black hole for gambling debts. She hadn't come to me 3 years ago because the divorce ruined her. She came to me because she had voluntarily bankrupted herself to fund her golden child's delusions, and she needed a scapegoat to act as her personal ATM. My massive monthly rent payments weren't just covering her expenses, they were the only thing keeping Chase out of federal court. This brings me to a truth about the golden child and scapegoat dynamic that you must understand if you are ever going to stop feeling guilty for walking away. The golden child is never actually loved more, they are simply used differently. The narcissistic parent views the golden child as an extension of their own ego, a vanity project that must succeed at all costs to prove the parent's worth. The scapegoat, on the other hand, is the utility player. We are the dumping ground for their shame, their failures, and their financial burdens. They don't mistreat you because you are flawed. They mistreat you because your competence threatens them, and your independence terrifies them. You are expected to bleed quietly so the golden child can shine loudly. When you finally cut off the supply, the system doesn't just stall, it implodes. They don't miss you. They miss the infrastructure you provided. The aftermath of that implosion happened exactly 14 days later. I was finally settled back into my own house. The locks were changed, the basement was cleared of Chase's absurd streaming equipment, and the silence in the living room was beautiful. It was a Tuesday evening. I was reading a book when the newly installed doorbell camera chimed. I opened the app. Standing on my front porch, completely soaked from the evening rain, was Helen. I didn't open the door right away. I stood in the hallway, watching her through the peephole. She looks 10 years older. The manufactured, pristine image was gone. Her hair was a mess, her expensive trench coat was wrinkled, and she was visibly shaking. I slowly unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, leaving the heavy security chain firmly in place. She didn't start with her usual arrogance. She didn't demand entry. To my absolute shock, my mother, the woman who had thrown a party with champagne to celebrate my homelessness, sank to her knees on the wet concrete of my porch. "He left," she sobbed, her voice cracking, stripped of all its theatrical power. "Chase took the truck. He emptied the joint account. He left me at a motel in the valley and blocked my number. Please, I have nowhere else to go. I'm your mother. Please let me come home." It was the ultimate, tragic climax of the narcissistic family system. The golden child, having extracted every ounce of financial and emotional capital his mother possessed, had discarded her the exact second she ceased to be useful. She had sacrificed her dignity, her financial security, and her only functional daughter to prop him up, and he had thanked her by leaving her stranded at a cheap roadside motel. I looked down at the woman kneeling in the rain. A few years ago, the sight of her crying would have sent me into a blind panic of people-pleasing and appeasement. I would have unlatched the chain, brought her inside, made her tea, and signed up for another decade of indentured servitude. But as I stood there, looking at her, I kept my voice steady. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no vindication. Just a cold, quiet pity. "This is my home, Helen," I said, devoid of any cruelty or warmth. "You don't live here anymore. And you never will again." I gently closed the solid oak door. I slid the deadbolt locked. I walked back to my living room, sat down on my couch, and finally exhaled. There is a profound, life-altering realization that comes in the aftermath of a moment like that. We are culturally conditioned to believe that family is an unbreakable bond, that blood dictates an infinite capacity for forgiveness. But forgiveness does not require reconciliation. You can forgive someone for being broken, while simultaneously refusing to let their brokenness destroy you. Leaving quietly, legally, and permanently is the most powerful thing you can do. When you refuse to scream, when you refuse to engage in their dramatic, cyclical wars, you take away their ammunition. Setting a boundary isn't about making the other person understand your pain. It's about accepting that they never will and deciding that your future is no longer tied to their comprehension. You do not owe your sanity to the people who gave you your trauma. You owe yourself the peace of a quiet house, a locked door, and a life that belongs entirely to you. So what do you think? Did I go too far or not far enough? Let me know in the comments below.